So this piece started with an installation we were doing in a nearby town, and this is what the madrone looked like after we get it off the job site. And this was a standing dead that was being removed for fire prevention. First step is to strip it of all the bark. So I'm using a peeler blade and a wire brush to get that excess bark off. Now that we have the piece roughed out here, next step is really to start marking out those divots, kind of the wrinkles in the fabric, so to say. And this madrone is really hard stuff. It's dense, so carving those the carving part is actually not difficult. The sanding part is pretty tedious. So you'll see that here many hours into sanding. The next step is to line out the constriction of where that rope's going to be tied around this piece. I'm just carving lines into the surface of the wood just to get that rough shape. And the next step would be to carve that deeper and deeper as you go along. I'm using a grinder with a cut-saw disc. It's a abrasive disc. On that, it's a tooth tungsten disc that I'm just removing the material with. I have a big one that's 6 inches in diameter, and you can get a little too comfortable with them. And they're a lot easier to use when you remove the guard, which I don't recommend. So I'm just continuing to grind the piece. You remove more and more material to make those divots more pronounced as I go, and kind of blend them in with the surface so it looks like it's a material being constricted. And you'll see what happens here. I end up switching to a larger disc right there. I'm using the 4-inch, but I switched to a 6-inch disc, and I get a little complacent with it. And here's an image of what happened. So that piece caught on some loose clothing and pulled itself right up to my neckline, caught in my sweatshirt, and bound up, luckily without doing any damage. But it was a close call. It was definitely a little eye-opener, and I don't recommend doing what I did here. It was a mistake. I pulled off the guard. I didn't have a guard that size, and that disc is a lot easier to use without the guard, but clearly it's extremely dangerous. It can, I've removed some knuckle skin many times, and that was a closer call than I was comfortable with. So definitely don't recommend doing what I did here. It was a good learning experience. So here I'm just kind of testing that rope, seeing what it looks like on the piece, seeing how it fits those grooves. And then I'm hitting it with a sander. So I'm just taking more material off with a rough grit. I think that's a 60 or an 80 grit disc, and removing more material and kind of blending it in. And you can see in the background there's a pretty good storm coming in. So now that we have the piece roughed out and the general shape of those, the bulges here, the next step is going to be to mark out where those wrinkles are going to be to make this look more like a fabric. So we're going to be lining out the fold. So I'm just marking the piece with a Sharpie, and then we're going to carve those in and then sand those out to make it look like a smooth, silky material. So the effect, you can see all these black lines are where I'm going to carve these folds into the wood. And the effect is like this. So here's a finished piece. And this is stained in a dark stain. This one's redwood. This other one is madrone, which is new for me, and I'm loving working with it. Redwood's a pain, but beautiful. Ended up ordering this Festool sander. This thing to get into these grooves, which are extremely tedious, was a lifesaver. This saved a lot of time. And it's not too expensive. I think it was about 150 bucks or something. And this carving piece from Arbortech to carve those grooves is just fantastic. So 2 tools that this project kind of landed me on that I'll use for years, I'm sure. And it's been a fun little learning experience. I'm excited to get this piece looking a little more complete. You can see the black lines here. Those are where I'm going to carve in those folds in the wood, or what should look like fabric ultimately. So the next step here is to carve in those grooves, and I'm using the carving tool to rough them out. So you can see what these divots look like just roughed out, and you know, they're obviously quite rough, but once you sand them out, they tend to look much more natural and kind of silky smooth. So at this point, I'm using the pneumatic sander to smooth out those very rough grooves cut with the Arbortech carving tool. And it's a 3-part process, really. The Arbortech to rough these grooves out. Then I'm using this pneumatic sander, which is a 2-inch disc with maybe an 80 grit paper on it. And then ultimately, you'll see in the next clip, I'm using the Fest tool, which has kind of a pointed sanding pad, which allows me to get a kind of a V into those grooves, which is a little more natural, almost like the fabric's folding over on itself. This is another invaluable tool here. What I'm doing here is just carving in where that knot's gonna seat into the wood itself, so it looks like it's compressing into the wood like the rest of the rope is. And I'm using a carving tool with a tungsten carbide bit on it, and just relieving that in, you know, kind of the shape of the knot. So I marked out the knot and then carving that in so that it kind of seats into the wood and looks like it's compressing into it. So once we have the piece carved and sanded, the next step is to create a base for it. The piece stands fine on its own, but you know, I worry about it sitting in someone's home and being too tippy, because it, you know, could be dangerous for a kid. So it needs a nice solid heavy base. And I decided to use this piece of 1/4-inch plate that I plasma cut out on our plasma table, and I think it's 18 inches in diameter. And I'm going to weld a piece of flat bar, you know, roll a piece of flat bar out in a circle and weld that to the base, and then finish that material and blacken it so that it's, you know, it looks kind of antiqued. And that's going to be then mechanically connected to the bottom of the piece, so it gives it a bigger base so that it's, stable in its environment. Here we're just welding up the base to the flat bar and then grinding that weld off so you have a nice clean edge. The idea is to make that base kind of disappear, so I decided to blacken it. I use a Sculpt Nouveau product called I think it's called Black Magic or Slate Black, and it's a blackening product. It's just a spray-on product that immediately darkens the steel, especially if it's raw steel, if you've taken the mill scale off. So again, here we're just placing the piece on the base itself to make sure that the size is appropriate for the piece. And I think bases are really important. They're almost as important as the piece itself. Doing something that's appropriate for the sculpture itself, I find to be incredibly important. This one I'm pretty happy with. I think it works with that piece with the circular shape and the color. Decided to go with a mechanical connection to connect that base to that madrone. That madrone's so dense that I had no concern about using a lag screw from the underside. So I ended up using timber screws. I drilled some holes in the base itself and then used a whole series of timber screws going up into that wood. So that gets pre-drilled and then timber screws driven up through the bottom of the base, for that connection. And that's going nowhere. If you're going to clear coat something, you want it to be free of moisture. So I'm using heat just to chase that moisture, and you can see how the process goes. You can see that the moisture coming out of that metal as it's being chased out with the heat. This is always a fun part of the process because you know you're getting close to being done signing your piece. And here I'm just using a burning tool, wood burning tool. And these things work great. It's a little tool that heats up to red hot, and you can write like a pen. So it's a great way to sign a piece, especially if you're finishing it with an oil finish. I decided to use a tung oil on this piece. I really like tung oil, and the one downside to tung oil is it can take quite a long time to dry. So you really need to make sure that you give it adequate time for each coat to dry before buffing and finishing. And I'll often use a tung oil and then a wax over top of that. But again, one thing I learned the hard way is you really need to make sure that tung oil has adequate time to dry before you wax that, put that top coat on of wax, because it can be a mess if you don't do that. Use a variety of waxes on pieces. In this case, it's a bowling alley wax, and it's got a dryer in it. Paste it on and let it dry, and then you buff it off, and it gives it that kind of satin finish. Again, lots of coats. More coats the better, in my opinion, but that gives this piece kind of that luster and that shine, almost like a silk would look. So that's it for Tethered. Thanks for coming along for the ride. Each one of these pieces is unique, and each one's going to have its own little details, its own story. We have a lot of pieces that are going to be coming off the shop here soon, and we're going to document that process with each one. So if you like that process and you find this interesting, subscribe, and we'll keep sending them out and getting you content. This piece, Tethered, is going to be on display at one of our local galleries, so I'll put a link below there. And if you'd like to see it in person and you're local, come on by and say hi.